Greetings to everybody. Welcome to the second talk in this year's noon lecture series sponsored by the University of Michigan Center for Japanese Studies. My name is Micah Auerbach, and I'm pleased to be the introducer for our speaker today. Before I talk about him, though, I'd like to discuss briefly some points of interest to lots of you probably. First, as I mentioned, this is our second in a long series of talks every day at noon. For a complete schedule for the talks to be held this semester, you're welcome to pick up a flyer on the table on your way out. That will tell you what remaining talks are happening, and I encourage you to attend as many as possible. Second, I'd like to remind you that the Center for Japanese Studies sponsors a film series every year. This year, our fall film series is starting soon on October 11th. It's being held in partnership with the State Theater downtown, and it's a retrospective of the major works produced by Studio Ghibli. I'm sure that will be of interest to many of you. Copies of the flyer with information about this film series are also available on the table, so you're welcome to take all of the above. The talk today will last approximately until 1 p.m., and I would like to remind you that the clock on the wall is a little bit fast. It's just now 12:11. After it's over, we'll have something like 15 or maybe 20 minutes of question and answer directed by our guest, and after the Q&A is over, I'll stand up and formally thank our speaker. On to his introduction. Today I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Professor Seth Jacobowitz of the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures at Yale University. Although it's not the precise topic of today's talk, Professor Jacobowitz has a strong and long-term research interest in the question of technological mediation in the making of modern Japanese literature. For instance, the effects of the new technique of shorthand on the literary representation of reality and fiction in Japan from the late 19th century. His forthcoming monograph on that topic is titled Writing Technology in Meiji Japan, Media, Language, and Modern Literature, and it's due out from the Harvard Asia Center just about a year from now in fall of 2015. Professor Jacobowitz also has an impressive record in translation from Japanese to English. This includes, but is not limited to, the very comprehensive book, the Edogawa Rampo Reader, which he published in 2008 with a critical introduction. For anybody who's a fan of stories of mystery, of detective fiction, stories of the grotesque, I highly advise you to have a look at this collection. Professor Jacobowitz's most recent work, however, takes a different tack. He's now interested in all manner of relations between Japan and Brazil, a country which absorbed, as it turns out, not just a large number of Japanese immigrants, but a large quantity of Japanese artistic and literary ideas. The topic that he's talking about today, the particular speaker who's involved in narratives of Japanese immigration to Brazil, is also the author behind a novel whose publication is due from Professor Jacobowitz also in about a year. He'll be translating, or we'll be able to read his translation of a novel by Ishikawa Tatsuzo, first published in 1935, and the title that Professor Jacobowitz will give the English is The Immigrants. So there's already a lot of stuff to read, and there's more forthcoming. For a little taste of it, I urge you to follow along with his lecture today. Thank you kindly.
Thank you, Micah. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I was actually in Michigan as recently as April for a symposium on the author Natsume Soseki, so it's really a pleasure to be back here so quickly and before it starts snowing. Okay, so beginning with the historic voyage of the Kasato Maru from Kobe to the port of Santos in 1908, transoceanic passage subsidized by Japan and/or Brazil brought almost 200,000 Japanese immigrants to Brazil in the early 20th century. Few works of literature from the period better depicted the perils and rewards of leaving the homeland for a world away in tropical South America than Ishikawa Tatsuzo's novel Sobo, as I've translated the title, The Emigrants, from 1935, or Shimazaki Toson's travelogue Nanbei Imin Ken Choroku, or A Record of South American Immigration, published in 1937. In this presentation, I would like to explore some of the ideological and aesthetic contexts in which these works were written, published, and received. Both works were promoted in the mid-1930s as a kind of immigrant literature, or imin bungaku, that defined a third way alongside what we typically think of as simply modern Japanese literature, or which we might even call Imperial literature, teikoku bungaku, and overseas or colonial literature, which was typically in Japanese called gaichi bungaku. Gaichi refers to the Japanese colonies, Taiwan, Korea, also Manchuria, places like Sakhalin, and so forth. So in a certain sense, Brazil was also part of that overseas, I don't want to use the word empire here, but certainly overseas territories that were part of the Japanese empire and part of the Japanese imperial imagination. Okay. So in my talk today, I would first like to identify the 50-day transoceanic steamship voyage as a focal point itself within the two works. This includes the difficulties and expense involved in getting to South America, the treatment of the Japanese in the British-controlled port towns along the way, the ambivalent attitudes of the immigrants toward their homeland, and their aspirations and fears for a new life in their adopted land. In each of these myriad contexts, the lengthy voyage itself led both writers to meditate on the paradox of the Japanese Empire, encouraging mostly the rural poor to emigrate, while also seeking to maintain them as loyal imperial subjects. A second point I want to raise is that by the mid-1930s, the notion of the autonomous professional writer was increasingly untenable. Ishikawa was the younger of the two, and in some ways the more controversially critical writer of immigration, colonialist expansion, and war. Toson, on the other hand, was a romantic poet turned naturalist writer from the Meiji period. By 1936, when he made the voyage, long past his prime as a novelist, he did in fact make this voyage himself, and hence his travelogue, which is published in 1937. So he was long past his prime as a novelist, but still a widely respected figure in the literary establishment. So alongside a close reading of the texts, it is also necessary to take into account the degrees to which Ishikawa and Toson were conscripted into or resisted the cultural apparatuses of the state, affirming immigration as a patriotic duty and as an integral component of the Japanese Empire. Between familiar narratives of Japanese immigration to North America and Hawaii on the one hand, and narratives of Japanese imperialist expansion in East Asia on the other, Brazil continues to occupy a very liminal place in studies of modern Japanese literature and history. Eiichiro Azuma critiques the fact that immigration and colonization are often treated as separate and mutually exclusive fields of study by scholars in Asian studies and Asian American studies, despite the fact that the two discourses were intricately linked. Although it does not imply moral equivalence. For instance, hardline proponents of Japanese imperial expansion saw immigration as an extension of Japanese power and influence. And as Azuma explains, I'm going to give a little bit of a lengthy quote here. Instead of simply creating the infrastructure of imperial rule within Japan proper, they, the advocates of Japanese expansion, argued that the country should embark on a project of real empire building through mass emigration, international trade, and if necessary, proactive military deployment. Because the emigration of rural people to Hawaii and the American West had just begun in the mid-1880s, nationalists willingly mistook the popular practice of temporary work abroad, dekasegi, for the first instance of Japanese colonialist expansion in the modern era. Founded by the hardliners in 1893, the Colonization Society, or Shokumin Kyokai, reified such conceptual confusions because its members equated state-supported colonialist ventures in Asia and the Pacific with mass labor migration to the Americas. While calling for an imperialist war, such pundits expressed a desire to see more and more subjects of their quote-unquote expansive nation migrating abroad for the quote-unquote conquest of frontiers and the building of new Japans beyond Japanese shores. Okay, so that was the quote from Azuma. He has in mind here only immigration to Hawaii and the United States prior to 1907. The case becomes more complex when dealing with Brazil and South America. And I say this because in contrast to the typical diaspora model, whereby immigrants left the homeland simply for better economic opportunities, in the case of Brazil, and of course there are other countries in South America, Peru, Bolivia, and so forth, from 1908, there were well-defined policies by the Japanese government backing up efforts not only to send immigrants overseas, but also to keep them linguistically, culturally, and in some very specific ways nationalistically within the fold, or if you will, within the folk of the Japanese Empire. And this is the case even when there was no reasonable expectation of their return to Japan. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Let me give you another image here. Oops. This is actually a useful indication of the volume of the mass migration. So 1908, the inaugural voyage of the Kasato Maru, which had a very small number of immigrants, very quickly led into the 1920s and 1930s into steamships with about 800 to 1,000 immigrants per ship, leaving, at the rate of once a week or even more frequently. Okay, so we really get a sense of the kind of exponential rise up until, of course, 1941, when the outbreak of World War II led to the curtailing of immigration, and then it picks up in 1952 after the war is over. Okay, and I have another. I can always come back to these in the Q&A. Oops. This gives us this one's in rather small print Japanese, but gives us a very good indication of the route that was taken. Okay. The immigration that began in 1908 quickly gathered steam in the 20s and 30s, so that even after the opening of the frontier in Manchuria in the early 1930s, Brazil still continued to draw, as we just saw, something like 20 to 25,000 immigrants per year. Now, it goes without saying that Brazil was not only not in East Asia, but a sovereign nation well outside Japan's long-standing relations with the West. Now, the voyage to Brazil typically went by way of Kobe, where the Immigration Processing Center was located. That's the term they use, but I'll say more about that in a moment. To Hong Kong, then to Singapore, then to Colombo in Sri Lanka, and then to Durban or Cape Town in South Africa, and then finally on to Brazil, to Rio de Janeiro or Santos, which is a large port just outside the city of Sao Paulo. Okay, and then from there, many of the immigrants would go on to Sao Paulo State, which was where many of the booming coffee plantations were. Okay, so this voyage really serves well, and I'll go back to the other one here with the Kasato Maru kind of superimposed in the front. It really serves well to illustrate a remapping of geographic and cultural borders between the Japanese Empire and its neighboring countries to the south, the new republics of South America, and of course the European powers in the pre-war period who continued to exercise considerable control over shipping lanes, trade routes, and international ports. Perhaps more critically, Brazil and South America, Nanbe in Japanese, came to be located by the 1930s within the Japanese imperial imagination as a primitive and underdeveloped extension of the exotic tropical lands of the South Seas, Nanyo or Nankai, that offered a better quality of life than the hardscrabble existence in Japan's rural interior. Within the framework of Japanese imperialism, moreover, the Southern expansionist doctrine, or Nanshinron, looked to the global south, running from the South Pacific and Southeast Asia, around Africa, all the way to South America, for trade, immigration, and, at least in the case of Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, for potential military conquest. By contrast, the northern expansion route, backed by the Japanese Imperial Army, had already led to colonization by force of Sakhalin, Korea, Manchuria, and so on. So the image of Brazil, and South America more generally, in Japan is confirmed in the kind of overseas immigration campaign advertisements that I've tried to excerpt here for you, portraying Brazil as a new paradise, Shintenshi in Japanese, or promised land of fertile and abundant agricultural land. Okay. Here are two more. Okay. We see, I'm going to just step away from the mic for a moment. New promised land, paradise, those kind of ideas. Okay. And I actually have one more. I rather like this one, which has the Sugarloaf Mountain in Rio de Janeiro at the top, although, of course, no one was planting anything there, so I guess it was just for show. For the most part, the Brazil envisioned by the immigrants in both of the literary works is devoid of any history of racial conflict or even linguistic or cultural difference. Rather, the immigrants struggle to learn some basic Portuguese while en route, but there's almost nothing in the way of speculation about how they will be welcomed by the Brazilians. For example, what foods they will eat, how they will live. Rather, their primary concern is to locate fellow countrymen, usually family members or acquaintances from hometowns who had already made the voyage and were established, or at least better established. Brazil amounts to a new southern frontier, beyond Japanese sovereignty, but also ripe for development by well-organized, cooperative Japanese immigrant communities. In part, the unevenness experienced by the Japanese immigrants was due to voluntary closure of immigration to the United States under the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907, and by immigration restrictions in other Anglophone countries, the White Australia policy, which began even earlier in 1901. Okay, that led Japan to look elsewhere to disburden its rural provinces of surplus agricultural labor, as well as the potential for economic and political unrest. Brazil, meanwhile, had terribly mistreated Southern European immigrants sent to work in the coffee plantations right up to about World War I, to say nothing of the African slaves who had only been freed at the very end of the 19th century, and the Indians exploited for their labor in that nation's interior. So in the case of the Southern European immigrants, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and so forth, actually refused to send further immigrants to Brazil until labor conditions were improved. Okay, so from both sides, this serves to remind us that Japan was not only the furthest away from Brazil geographically, but also one of the last options, sort of on either side's party, to resolve Japan's need to send people somewhere and Brazil's endemic labor shortages that prevented it from modernizing or more effectively participating in commodity capitalism through products like coffee. In this sense, there's a bitter irony to the reality that neither country was the first choice of the other. The Japanese-Brazilian immigration was, from the start, a marriage of convenience, or a geopolitical necessity. On the other hand, as Jeffrey Lesser explains in his book Negotiating National Identity, proponents and foes of the Japanese immigration within Brazil saw the swelling tide of Japanese immigrants as a genuine force capable of transforming Brazilian modernity. So the proponents either saw affinities between the Japanese and indigenous Indians, or else invoked the honorary white status conferred upon the Japanese by the first Portuguese traders and missionaries to Japan in the 16th century. In either case, the proponents believed the Japanese would make ideal contributors to the hybrid racial makeup of a modern Brazil, and would demonstrate the same success in modernizing the nation's industries as Japan itself had done a generation earlier. Xenophobic opponents, meanwhile, cited the Yellow Peril fears that had led to the closure of Japanese immigration in the United States, as well as Japan's growing imperialist aims in the Far East, as proof of a similar agenda in Brazil. So with that context established, let me now turn to Ishikawa Tatsuzo. And for those of you who know his work writing about war and indeed about the novel I'm going to be talking about today, I couldn't help but put up this picture, which was rather ironically sort of his profile picture on Wikipedia, showing him with golf clubs and golf balls, looking very non-proletarian. So Ishikawa Tatsuzo made the voyage to Brazil in 1930. The picture on the left, I think, is a little bit more accurate. The one on the right is a much later picture of him. He made the voyage to Brazil in 1930 as an onboard supervisor of the immigrants, and then he returned to Japan in the same capacity several months later. So he was not a true immigrant himself, but he was certainly an observer. He wrote a travelogue of his own, Saikin Nambe Oraiki, or Recent Travels to South America, in the following year. The novel The Emigrants was thus written at a remove of about 5 years. Okay. Surprisingly, the novel won the first Akutagawa Prize in 1935, then and now the most prestigious literary prize in Japan. As Japanese literary scholar Kawamura Minato has noted, the prize was awarded by an 11-member distinguished committee, including such luminaries as Kikuchi Kan, Tanizaki Junichiro, Kawabata Yasunari, Yokomitsu Riichi, and Sato Haruo, who recognized the novel's literary contribution in its accounting of immigration to Brazil at the height of Japanese imperial expansion. And the novel beat out many of the representative established genres of the time period, from the avant-gardist New Perceptionist school, Shinkankakuha, proletarian literature, the I novel, and so forth. Although the novel is commonly thought to be about immigrant life in Brazil, very little in it actually deals with coffee plantations or the Japanese immigrant settlements. Instead, it follows a handful of individuals among the nearly 1,000 immigrants who make the voyage aboard a ship called the La Plata Maru. Beginning with the processing of immigrants through the National Overseas Immigration Processing Center in Kobe, the novel traces their fears, expectations, and of course interpersonal relationships over that 50-day voyage, in this case going through Hong Kong, Singapore, Colombo, Durban, before arriving in Rio de Janeiro, and then finally Sao Paulo. It's really only in the closing pages that the immigrants disperse to their respective work destinations, and they're described as being like, quote, drops of water into a bucket, disappearing into the vastness of the country. Let me just briefly pause. This immigration center in Japanese, the original name for it is the Kokuritsu Kaigai Imin Shuyosho. Shuyosho is typically used in contemporary Japanese to refer, for instance, to the internment camps, such as where the Japanese Americans were held, or something like the Nazi concentration camps, Gyosei Shuyosho. So it has a rather ominous sound to it, and I'll say a little bit more about that momentarily. The narrative structure of The Emigrants helps to reveal Brazil in the mindset of the immigrants as a semi-imagined place. The novel itself is divided into 3 parts. The first is called The Emigrants, the same as the title of the novel. The second part, South Seas Route, and then finally, A People Without a Voice. The novel opens with frenetic scenes of 1,000 or so of these rural workers and their families, converging from all across Japan at the immigration center in Kobe. And the novel accurately reflects the rules put in place since 1908. Given the prohibitive expense of transoceanic passage, it would be highly unlikely for most prospective immigrants to return to Japan again. Okay, so in this case, Ishikawa and Toson were highly exceptional, right? The exceptions, not the rule. Consequently, the Brazilian government insisted upon the basic unit of immigration to be the family, not individuals. I'm just going to go back to one of the earlier slides. Okay, the one on the left is by far the most iconic immigration poster, and what the figure is saying, he's holding a scythe, and he has like dolls and sort of the family in miniature tucked under his arm, pointing to Brazil, in case the prospective immigrants didn't know where they were actually going. And he's saying, gather your family and let's go to South America. Okay, so that issue of family was very important. Immigrants would, in fact, at times form artificial families expressly for the purpose of satisfying this requirement. Upon arrival in Brazil, they could safely dissolve the bogus arrangement. And certainly one of the families in the emigrants reflects this reality. The prospective immigrants were also subjected to a regimen of vaccinations and health inspections. Immigrants with highly contagious diseases, such as tuberculosis or cholera, even assuming that they made it past inspection in Kobe, could still risk being denied entry into Brazil. Okay. So moving along, the novel consists of dated entries, like a journal, that tracks the progress of the voyage from Kobe to Santos. Akin to the proletarian novel, the narrator shows how the working-class characters are not yet masters of their own fate, despite the stoicism and determination to better their lot. The two nations and immigration companies determine who goes where and with whom. Also consistent with proletarian fiction, the narrator reveals the uneven distribution of the market forces of capitalism. In other words, what lies behind the need for labor here and not there. In perhaps the most startling insight, the immigrants witness the movement of goods at the port of Colombo in then Ceylon. And I'll read this quote that I've translated. The Indians, dusky-skinned and twice the size of Oizumi-san, with muscular shoulders, opened the hatch cover and began to unload bundles of Japanese cotton and hundreds of cotton fabric. Japanese cotton fabric was bound for Colombo, Ceylon black tea was bound for Cape Town, Brazilian coffee was bound for North America, and North American unprocessed cotton was bound for Japan. The global economy moved along with the La Plata Mar ship. In other words, global wealth undulated quickly. The immigrants observed it all without interest, this surprising economic movement, as if it were from the moon. So what's clear here to the reader, if not perhaps to the immigrants themselves, is that they too are another commodity in a global marketplace that co-opts their participation and no less efficiently exploits them. This and other textual passages confirm what the reader has already been told about the immigrants' knowledge and expectations prior to their arrival in their adopted land, namely that Brazil is not yet an actual place to them, simply an unknown quantity. Literally, it is called a fantasy. Their first contact with Hong Kong, in which only a few immigrants are allowed to disembark, is their first glimpse of life outside Japan, and it provides some reassurance. Quote, "The immigrants visited a foreign land for the first time in their lives, but it was not so very different. This may have caused them to lose some of their high hopes for Brazil, but there was nothing to cause them to be afraid. At least they now knew the foreign mountains and seas were not so different compared to Japan. Perhaps this did constitute a great discovery. They'd imagined the foreign land as a fantasy, and now they had a more concrete and favorable impression." So while the bulk of the novel concerns what takes place at the Immigration Processing Center or along the voyage to Brazil, by contrast, the final section, The People Without Voice, is a mere wrap-up, with its almost but not quite happy ending as the immigrants embark on their new lives. The novel somewhat abruptly ends at that point, with the dispersal of the immigrants to their respective destinations within Brazil. There's no real sense how their lives will be transformed, for better or worse, by their adopted country. Amongst the immigrants, though, there remains a very strong sense of imperial duty. One of the young men, Magoichi, threatens to abandon his intentions to emigrate when his honor is questioned for avoiding military service. One of the young women, Onatsu, who is courted by 3 of the Japanese men on board the La Plata Maru, unquestionably accepts that her fate will be set by her choice of husband, presumably from among the 3, and the family she will raise with him will be Japanese. The immigrants also take pains to look modern by assuming Western dress, or in the case of women with children, by not carrying babies on their back whenever they leave the ship. They shout banzai. They celebrate the birthday of the emperor. So there is no talk of giving up Japanese citizenship. The closest expression to discontent is when the character Horiuchi likens rural laborers in Japan to dead leaves. While they are alive and productive, the tree holds on to them. But once they dry up, they fall off and are blown away to gather in places like the immigration center at Kobe. So that one expression aside, this dynamic of patriotism really wasn't much embellished by Ishikawa. The Japanese government kept Koseki records for those living and working overseas, and actively encouraged identification with Imperial Japan. In fact, some of the most ardent supporters of the Japanese Empire were in Brazil. Curiously enough, there was a kind of hardline faction that refused to believe Japan lost the war. They thought this was some kind of propaganda. And for a very long time, they actually maintained this kind of willful self-delusion. Before turning to Toson, it would be remiss not to point out that the version we read today is a post-war edit, or revision. Aoki Nobuo's study of Ishikawa Tatsuzo shows that the original publication in the journal Seiza had fuseji, or excised words, by government censors in some 542 places, such as the seemingly innocuous deep sigh of relief by the character Magoichi upon leaving Japan. So paradoxically, if it was the patriotic duty of the rural poor to leave Japan and find prosperity elsewhere, such truths could only be articulated circumspectly. You're not supposed to breathe a deep sigh of relief. With its representations of rape, disease, labor exploitation, and the uncertainties of life in a distant, sultry tropical climate, the novel further confirmed the hardships awaiting the immigrants. The character Muramatsu, who supervises the 1,000 or so immigrants aboard the La Plata Maru, and who thus most closely resembles Ishikawa's own experience, thinks to himself, if one must be poor, it would be better to be poor in Brazil. Well, think about that for a moment. Certainly from our contemporary perspective, there are no favelas in Japan, obviously. This seems like a shocking statement. But Muramatsu justifies the claim because in Brazil the immigrants would be under no obligations to comply with punitive laws for heavy taxation or compulsory military service. In short, the novel makes clear that interwar era Japan was indeed a lousy place to be rural and poor. Better to take your chances in that distant and tropical land far to the south than eke out a hard-scrabble existence in the interior of the archipelago. This is actually a color photo of the Tor Hotel, which was next to the immigration center. It's interesting because in Japanese it's pronounced Toa, so you might think, like East Asia, but actually it was the name came from English TOR. So there's a mistranslation in the Portuguese translation, but it won't be in the English one. Anyway, just move along here. So these are two pictures of Shimazaki Toson. One as sort of in his middle years. The one on the right is when he was 66 years old, the time of his voyage to Brazil. In fact, I have another picture here. He's in the center on board the ship called the Rio de Janeiro Maru. So Toson's voyage was made under very different auspices than Ishikawa or his fictionalized characters on the La Plata Maru. Although he traveled with 851 immigrants on this Rio de Janeiro Maru bound for Brazil, Toson's ultimate destination was in fact Buenos Aires. He went as Japan's first representative to the 14th Congress of the International Pen Club, which was held in Buenos Aires in 1936. Does anybody know what the Pen Club stands for? I mean, I had no idea. I looked it up myself. It's no shame. Poets, essayists, and novelists. Okay, very, very clever, right? And indeed, we're reading a kind of essay by a novelist, so it seemed appropriate. But as president of Japan's Pen Club, Toson's desire to see Japanese writers emerge from their long-standing geographical and linguistic isolation from Western colleagues was, of course, severely compromised by Japan's imperialist expansion into East Asia. Creation of the puppet government and new state of Manchukuo in 1932 had not been recognized internationally, leading Japan to exit the League of Nations the following year. As Inaga Shigemi has noted, the creation of the Japanese branch of the Pen Club was itself in part funded by the government to compensate for Japan's political ostracization. Toson was accompanied on this journey by former Shirakawa novelist Arishima Ikuma, who was the Japanese Pen Club vice president, and it didn't hurt that he was handily fluent in French and Italian. Along with Toson, who spoke English and French, they undertook this long, arduous journey, and remember, he's an old man at this point. They undertook the journey for political as well as cultural considerations, curiously, none of which make it into Toson's travelogue. They intended, Toson and Arishima, that is, intended to propose for the 1940 Pen International Congress to meet in Tokyo to coincide with the Tokyo Olympics, which, as we all know, was canceled due to the outbreak of World War II. But in Buenos Aires, when we consider that Toson and Arishima were confronted by conflict between primarily the French and Italian representatives. The Italian futurist Marinetti was there, among other luminaries. The outgoing president of the Pen Club was actually H.G. Wells. So we begin to get some idea of the stature of the writers involved and the prestige of the Pen Club. But unfortunately, Toson ultimately did not make his proposal as planned due to this open conflict between the French and Italian factions. It became very clear that the Pen Club would not be receptive to Japan as another state using military means to achieve its aims, and which was also becoming increasingly aligned with the fascists. So Toson ultimately didn't press the issue. During his 17 days in Buenos Aires, he also gave 2 speeches and had several meetings with immigrant groups. Inaga provides a valuable analysis of those aspects of his trip, so I'm not going to try to recapitulate them here, although I'm happy to talk about them a little bit in the Q&A for those who are interested. Instead, I want to focus on his travelogue, specifically his observations about the treatment of the Japanese immigrants passing through the port towns, and a little bit about immigrant life in South America as well. As a novelist who gained fame in the Meiji period for his naturalist novel Hakai, or The Broken Commandment, in 1906, about discrimination against a burakumin, or outcast teacher, who ultimately decides to emigrate to Texas, Toson should have been an ideal candidate to observe and record the immigrant's voyage. What he calls, quote, the development of our countrymen, meaning prosperity and the proud standing of the Japanese in the world, extends not only to the colonies in South America, but to all of those thousands of Japanese transiting through the ports of call. In contrast to Ishikawa's novel, however, in the travelogue, there's almost nothing said about the immigrants as individuals. They remain mostly a collective mass, apart from the author, his wife, and fellow writer and intellectual Arishima. Toson wrote this account of the immigrants' passage for the Association of Research into the Question of Immigration, or Imin Mondai Kenkyukai, also founded in 1937 with funding from the Japanese Foreign Ministry. So this also kind of sheds light on the context for its writing. The book is divided into 29 short chapters, or more properly, entries. It's written in a very conversational style, and for the most part, lacking much in the way of literary embellishment or flourishes. In fact, it's fairly repetitive with locutions like tonikaku, at any rate, or anyways, peppering sentences, suggesting very little time spent on editing or revision. And again, given that Toson was 66 years old at the time of publication and would only live another 5 years, his preoccupations, perhaps understandably, lie with the treatment of the elderly, the very young, and those who have already passed on. For instance, when they stop off in Singapore, he pays a visit to the Japanese cemetery there, where Hasegawa Tatsunosuke was laid to rest. Better known for his pen name, Futabate Shime, he was, of course, a fellow Meiji-era novelist who had been canonized for writing, quote-unquote, the first modern Japanese novel. Toson was no doubt very aware of his own mortality, but it also comes as a kind of symbolic point, this visit to Futabate's grave, about Japanese writers making a name for themselves beyond Japanese shores. And we don't really have time to go into it, but Futabate was also a translator and critic, someone who was very interested in Russian literature and things going on outside of Japan in the 1920s, 19-teens and 20s, I should say. Toson also comments at length about the Japanese communities along the route, comparing the treatment the Japanese receive now in the mid-1930s versus 20 years earlier, the last time he had made the trip to Europe, when they were treated with contempt. Whereas the Japanese had previously been regarded, quote, regarded by the people of other countries as an uncivilized race, bunka no teido no hikui minzoku de atta. He says now, quote, now the appearance of the immigrants was nothing of the kind. Kyou no imi no sugata toyu mono wa keshite sonna mono ja gozaimasen. In fact, upon arrival in South Africa, Toson proudly relates how the Japanese are treated as equals, able to enter cafes and shops marked white only without hesitation. They were also able to conduct commerce there. While he shows some reservation about the discriminatory treatment towards black Africans and Chinese, his pride in the Japanese as being on par with the white Europeans shines through. In other words, he tacitly accepts the white-only privilege that Japan had made its own ideological imperative, and the wages of imperialism, or immigration, necessary to achieve that respect. He talks also at length about other difficulties that pervade internal movement within within Brazil. I'm going to try to skip over those in the interest of time, and come to what I think to be sort of the most interesting episode within the travelogue. Namely, in Buenos Aires, while depicting the multilingual and multicultural condition of the immigrants in South America, Toson pays a visit to elementary school students, of Japanese descent, who are already more proficient in Spanish than they are in Japanese. This is in Buenos Aires. Right? Already the uncoupling of ethnos and native language are becoming apparent. It's a kind of rear-guard action to keep them in the fold of nation and empire, of the nation and empire their parents had left behind. The feeling of having been abandoned by Japan, or being akin to dead leaves blowing in the wind, so keenly registered by Ishikawa, seems completely avoided by Toson. Instead, he offers a very rosy view, and what I think is almost certainly an apocryphal account of his visit to a kindergarten class in Buenos Aires, where he reads to the children the tale of Momotaro, or the Peach Boy, invading Onigashima, the island of demons. Toson's grandfatherly impulse to teach the children a kind of quote-unquote traditional Japanese fairy tale conceals a question at the heart of the quasi-colonial enterprise of South American immigration. In Toson's recounting, Momotaro becomes an allegory for the transformation of an extremely remote, wild, and inhospitable, even hostile land into a place fit for the Japanese to thrive and grow. I told the students the story of Momotaro, he writes, to their great delight, as it was a story they had heard before from their parents or teachers. But the times have changed so much. The main thrust of my telling of the story was to ask them, even if that was how the Momotaro of old handled things, what would he do if he lived today and went to Onigashima? One of the students responded, and it's not clear if it's a boy or a girl, that his or her mother had said that the demons of Onigashima had been replaced by human beings. The demons had gradually disappeared, and the land had become livable to humans, who toiled the land and planted flowers, so that if Momotaro lived today and journeyed to such a distant land, that rough land that was once home to demons could be transformed into a place where people could live. If one needed a parable for immigration as peaceful expansionism, this could be it. Momotaro, as an amiable settler who cultivates primitive land conveniently or preemptively vacated of hostile locals, would surely resonate with the immigrants dreaming of making it in the New World. Yet the story is particularly problematic given the multitude of ways Momotaro was appropriated during the war years, and this includes latterly two animated films, one in 1943 and another in 1945, the latter of which was clearly sponsored by the Japanese Imperial Navy. But even in the first, which is interspersed with actual footage from Pearl Harbor, Momotaro attacks the demons of Onigashima, now representing the British and Americans. In the second film, Momotaro is a general mobilizing the jungle animals on a remote island to liberate them from the British colonizers. And it ends with the animals sort of jumping out of a tree onto a map traced on the ground of the Americas, stomping all over the United States. While we can't obviously take Toson to task for these later iterations, certainly by 1936, 1937, Momotaro could hardly be taken for an innocent tale sans ideological, if not outright materialistic import. So let me try to make a few kind of tentative conclusions here, and then we can open up for questions. Ishikawa's receiving of the Akutagawa Prize for a new immigrant literature, and Toson's trip to South America in his capacity as president of the Japanese International Pen Club. These two things together, for me, contribute to what I think is a major goal of this part of my project, which is to try to complicate these tidy notions about immigration simply being something that happened without anyone taking much note of it in the literary establishment in Japan or sort of in the higher levels of the state. Okay, and so given the fact that even the Japanese Foreign Ministry was backing Toson's voyage and this sort of mission to try to bring the International Pen Club to Japan as a way of preventing Japan from being at least culturally, if not also diplomatically, isolated following its incursions into Manchuria, really underscores the sometimes subtle ways in which South America was imbricated into the Japanese Empire and into sort of state ideas about expansionism. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that both Ishikawa and Toson were not only reporting on the arduous conditions that were faced by the immigrants. This, again, is another kind of contemporary, rosy view of everybody making it without any problems. But the project that Ishikawa and Toson were also engaged in was an act of making visible a part of Japanese modernity that was in fact quite prosperous, that was in some ways a successful model. And of course this was 1935, 36, 37, right on the cusp of the years before Japan would descend into total war mobilization. So in a certain sense, this is a kind of quiet before the storm or opportunity for Japan to really promote something successful that was taking place far away, but nevertheless seemed to pose great potential into the future. Of course, it was a future that didn't exactly turn out as Ishikawa and Toson would have imagined in those days. Okay, so let me stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions if there are any.